tell me the rest of your story. I love vacation stories.
The sea was angry that day, my friends, like an old man trying to send back soup in the deli.
What are you talking about?
Oh, that's from Seinfeld.
Seinfeld?
You know, the show Seinfeld.
Was it on Broadway?
Boutros Ghali.
You mean the UN guy? Did he have something to do with it? Pretty sad track record. Somalia, Rwanda, the breakup of Yugoslavia. Still, I think he absorbed too much of the blame for the Angolan Civil War, don't you?
I don't judge. Who among us hasn't slipped into the break room to nibble on a Love Newton?
I don't follow what...
It's a Peterman thing, you know? It reminds me of the Haitian rattle torture.
You know, I feel like you're speaking an entirely different language.
Look, Mulva.
That's not my name. You know that's not my name.
Yes, but if I didn't know your name, but I knew your name rhymed with a part of the female anatomy, I might guess it was Mulva.
Maybe I should explain. I was a missionary in Burkina Faso from 1989 to 1998, and I missed a lot of things. I sometimes feel left out of American culture.
Burkina Faso?
Burkina Faso.
Yo-Yo Ma!
The cellist?
Is that a cellist?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I should explain that I'm from a distant star. On my journey here to Earth, the only things I saw were episodes of this program called Seinfeld. It taught me everything I know about this planet and its cultures.
That's really cute. You're really cute.
I am sponge-worthy, I assure you.
Okay, we're going to have to take this kind of slow. Maybe we should listen to this radio show about Seinfeld. And now he became obsessed with Parker Lewis Can't Lose and missed the whole Seinfeld thing. Colin McEnroe.
Yeah, I was not aware that Seinfeld was this big deal in the 90s. I was watching Parker Lewis Can't Lose. I knew all the catchphrases, too. All the Parker Lewis Can't Lose concepts and ideas that are now permanently embedded in American culture. The Seinfeld stuff I was not quite so aware of. So I have to say a couple of things. First of all, that preparing for this show has been an unusual experience, not only for me, but for the people who work anywhere near me. Because, you know, I mean, I'm supposed to be working, right? Well, I mean, to prepare for the show, the main thing I had to do was watch clips and old Seinfeld YouTube videos, which means I've just been sort of sitting in my office or standing in my office cackling for the last 2 days. So it doesn't really seem like I'm putting in hard days here, but the entire time my mind is worrying. I'll tell you the other thing. I decided we ought to do this show earlier this summer when I saw an article about the fact that some minor league baseball team, apropos of the 25th anniversary of the birth of Seinfeld, was doing this contest, and it was an Elaine Bennis bad dancing contest. So women would go out onto the field and dance badly in the manner of Elaine. And, you know, just noticing that, I thought, wow, there just are so many little cultural codes embedded now in us because of this program that really did represent in many ways a kind of Socratic investigation into what the unexamined rules of life really are, the unexamined behaviors, and that there really isn't a program anything like that. Seinfeld stands alone that way, I think. There are other really great sitcoms, but you can't say that about them. Anyway, that's my premise. As we go along here, we'll be happy to take your phone calls at 860-275-7266. Let me tell you about our guests, all of whom we're very excited about. Starting out with, in the NPR studios in Washington, Roger Catlin, a blogger and freelance writer. In D.C., his work appears in the Washington Post and Salon.com. Years ago, Roger was with the Hartford Courant with me. Also with us, another person from my past. I'll pop him up on the board right now, although a far more distant past. John O'Hurley, actor, television personality, author, the host of the game show Family Feud, author of 3 books, including The Perfect Dog, and of course he was Jay Peterman, Elaine's boss on Seinfeld. We should say that John and I went to school together for 4 or 5 years and performed together in productions both of us would probably like to forget. And also with us, Andy Robin. I've actually gone to the trouble of printing out a copy of Andy Robin's Wikipedia entry just because of the final line in it, which I think is almost Seinfeldian in its nature. It says, "He is not Andy Robin, Scottish wrestler and friend of Hercules the Bear." Andy Robin, do you ever wish you were the Scottish wrestler and friend of Hercules the Bear?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. It seems like
no, it seems like a very cool cool life, a much cooler life than mine.
Well, your life's pretty cool anyway. Andy Robin is a physician, writer, and director. Started his career at Saturday Night Live and spent several seasons at Seinfeld. We should say he's also from Stanford and attended West Hill High, which means the politics of Stanford High School, Ripperwam versus Stanford High versus West Hill, they're like warring Balkan states. It's something you almost don't even want to step into. But we know you didn't go to Stanford High because you'd have to have a name of one syllable on each name, like Dave Gold, Bruce Block, Doug Karp. Everybody at Stanford High had two-syllable names. All right.
Are you from Stanford?
No, but I went to school with a lot of those. I went to college with a lot of those people.
Okay.
All right. So where to begin? All of our guests are here. We can't wait to hear from you as well. But Roger, I am going to begin with you because you're the critic. And so, what do you think of my thesis that really, as you look at Seinfeld, I mean, it's a lot of different things, and it's basically, above all else, a very, very funny television show. But it's also this real investigation to what are the rules? What are the unwritten rules? Who can tell a Jewish joke? I mean, how many valid opinions can there be about using a handicap space? When is it too late to ask a person her name if you didn't catch it the first time? In these little kind of undocumented physical things of life. The first episode mentions the orange indicator on a coffee urn that proves to you that you're actually getting decaf. All these little sort of codes of life that we don't ever really talk about. They're sort of all there. Roger, react to that a little bit.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not so much those ladies in the baseball stadium were doing Elaine Bennis bad dancing, but Elaine Bennis was a commentary on the occasional person who thinks they're a good dancer, but they're a terrible dancer. It's just really good observations on everyday things, and I think that's the basis of a lot of good comedy. Specifically, it was the basis of Seinfeld's stand-up routine before he got involved with the sitcom. He'd take one little thing that everybody recognized and say, I mean, people made fun of him for it after a while. What's the deal with this? But that's exactly what Seinfeld did through its 9 seasons, and I think it was. You say it's never been done since. I think Larry David has continued it pretty strongly with Curb Your Enthusiasm. Seinfeld fans will certainly recognize the same kind of inquiries in that show.
Well, I would go a little bit further with the Elaine thing and say that if Socrates and one of his followers are walking around the Lyceum or wherever they were walking around, the question they might be asking is, in a world in which dancing is free form, in which, I mean, when we get to John in just a second, of course, John O'Hurley is a terrific dancer and was on Dancing with the Stars and essentially won. But most of us just do kind of free form dancing. In a world of free form dancing, can you be either good or bad at that kind of dancing? And of course, it turns out you can be really bad. But so that's the philosophical question that gets asked. So Andy Robin, with that in mind, I mean, I don't know if there's a way that you can recreate for us the genesis of a Seinfeld episode. How would it begin? What would you be told about what you might be working on, or what would you tell someone? He's at a loss for words. Either that or he's hung up on us. Okay, I'll slide over for a second. John O'Hurley, first of all, good to hear your voice again.
You as well. I'm one of the few people that has the advantage of knowing you in your misspent youth.
Exactly. So, one of the other qualities that Seinfeld had is that, in a way, certain things on Seinfeld would become more real within the universe of Seinfeld than they were anywhere else. And you're the primary example of it. I think I've read or heard somewhere that when you and the actual person who is named J. Peterman, the original founder of the catalog, appear together, you are addressed as Peterman rather than him, right?
Well, it is, yeah. The kind of PS to the Seinfeld story is that a year after Seinfeld ended, the real J. Peterman Company went through some financial difficulties. They went into Chapter 11, and within 6 months later, they called me because they'd gotten the intellectual property back. And John Peterman called me and said, let's put the company back together under our parallel strengths. And so he and I became the J. Peterman Company. So to say that I played the character on TV and now I own it is the odd truth. And I'm on the board, and when we walk down Madison Avenue together, people roll down their windows and scream, "Hey, Peterman," and they're not talking to him.
And so, Roger Catlin, this is a nice example of also the dragging forward of a tiny little detail of everyday life. I mean, I know a little bit of what your life has been like. You probably, like me, reading the New Yorker for years. That's where you would see it, right? In the New Yorker, if you're reading an article and there would be an ad, and it would usually show this hat, and it would say Peterman, J. Peterman. And I never thought too much about it, but clearly Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld were looking at that same ad and maybe looking at the calendar and thinking, well, what's the world behind that, right?
Exactly. And it's the perfect place for Elaine to work, too, where she, at one hand, she would be very good and attracted to this kind of high-profile company. On the other hand, she'd just be repulsed by all the things she had to do.
All right, so
and all the rules involved.
Let's hear John O'Hurley / Jay Peterman in one of his earliest encounters with Elaine.
Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I don't even know where I'm going.
Well, that's the best way to get someplace you've never been.
Boy. Yeah, I suppose that's true.
Have you been crying?
Yeah, see, this woman, this manicure...
Oh, no, it doesn't matter why. That's a very nice jacket.
Oh, thanks.
Very soft. Huge button flaps, cargo pockets, drawstring waist, deep bi-swing vents in the back, perfect for jumping into a gondola.
How do you know all that?
That's my coat.
You mean...
Yes. I'm Jay Peterman.
John O'Hurley, when you read the script on the page, it's hard to tell whether this is sort of intrinsically funny or not. When somebody handed you this script, did you think, I'm about to become an immortal comedy figure?
No, the exact opposite. Actually, they didn't have a script. Seinfeld was the most disorganized show on television. We never had a complete script at the reading, and so she had the idea that she would be working for me was something that was decided on later in the week. And they actually handed me the catalog before they even showed me a script. They just said, I just want him to sound the way the catalog is written, as though this stuff just trips off his tongue with a price, a size, and an availability attached. So that was it. And it just brought back, the first time I read it, it reminded me a little bit of a 40s radio drama combined with a bit of a bad Charles Kuralt. And so that was kind of the genesis of the character. But I had truly no idea what was going on.
Okay, I think we're back in touch with Andy Robin. Let me ask you my question again. And John just mentioned the word genesis. How did anything ever start on Seinfeld? In other words, are you able to sort of recreate for us the birth of an idea or a trope that you would build up into an episode?
So the whole thing's very mysterious. I'm not sure. Nobody had any reliable place to go to find story ideas. Sometimes I just remember everybody was just in this constant state of desperation for a good idea, and you're mining your personal life for funny things, and your history. It kind of put a crimp in my social life because I was living this meta existence. Every time a conversation with friends or something seemed threatened to get funny, I would start thinking about it as an idea that I could use and start, pulling myself out of the present. So, some things were funny things that you'd thought about often from way back when, characters, people you'd met, family members, but there was no pattern. The writers all had different sort of strengths and, very different sensibilities. So, like the show, I don't think people realize how varied the styles of the shows are. But if you look at that first season or even the first few seasons, they're very different. The stories are much more realistic and quieter than later shows, which it doesn't mean better or worse. It's just very different. I don't know. That's a long-winded answer.
No, but we love your long-winded answer. Let me ask you another question, which is there a particular example that you can think of something that happened in your life, something that you detected or a phrase that you picked up or a little physical detail that wound up in the series as a result of your kind of meta thinking about your own existence?
Well, sure. Lots of stories came from things we were doing around the office. So there was one of many stories that I mined from daily work at Seinfeld was from the very first time I pitched to Larry and Jerry. I was really nervous. I was a big fan of the show, and I had put together these stories for what would become the Junior Mint episode, and it seemed to go pretty well. And at the end of my pitch, Larry said, "Well, this is good. I want you to write this script." And that was pretty much the end of the meeting. And I thought, okay, well, Larry David wants me to write the script. Now he's got to lobby for me. He's got to talk to the network or talk to the other producers. And many days later, I still hadn't heard anything. And my agent calls and said, "You didn't tell me that you got the script." And I said, "Well, I didn't. Larry said he wants me to do it, but." And I didn't realize that Larry was the buck stopped there. So. So that became a story in, I forget which episode, but George gets a job. The guy says, "George, I like you. I want you to have this job. Of course." And he's interrupted after he says, "Of course." The phone rings, and George never finds out whether, what the conditions were on his employment. So that was, and from that very same first meeting with Larry and Jerry, they couldn't find the box of raisins that was in the room after I had left, and they wondered if I had stolen the raisins, and that became another story. So, any little thing that happened around the office had a good chance of making its way into a script.
And I have to say about the raisin thing, one of the people who works here, our former producer Patrick Scahill, who's now a reporter here, is a Seinfeld archivist, as people tend to be, just sort of a mental archivist. And so every time something happens, he now, in our office, he has a Seinfeld reference point for it. And we did have, I forget who it was, but somebody was here, and we give people water in mugs, in these sort of station mugs that have the insignia on it or the name of one of the shows. And they're supposed to drink the water and then put the mug down and leave. And whoever it was, he walked off with the mug. And immediately Patrick circulated around the raisins clip. He said, "Oh, we just got raisined," or something like that. So it sort of does come full circle that way. Now, first of all, let me sort of reintroduce everybody if you're just tuning in. And we may have to explain certain things because as Kion Wolf was pointing out before we started the show, I mean, Seinfeld is like one enormous private joke. Either you know what all these things mean, you know what the Junior Mints episode is, or you don't. And I'm assuming that some people who are listening might be in that latter category, so we have to make sure they don't feel completely excluded. Roger Catlin, a blogger, freelance writer, TV critic in D.C., he's with us from the NPR Washington studios. John O'Hurley, forever to be known as J. Peterman, but many other things as well, as an actor, television personality, and author. Andy Robin is a former writer and producer for Seinfeld and not a Scottish wrestler or a friend of Hercules the Bear. Please don't call us with any questions about that, but you can call us at 860-275-7266. John, I want to come back to you for a second because, Andy Robin was talking about how as this series grew, it grew in a different way. Instead of being constantly about this minutely observed detail of New York life and daily life, it got more and more fanciful. It got more and more, it reached further. And Peterman's kind of an example of that, right? He's in a way,
That's a very good observation. Yeah. If you look at the arc of the show, it moved from more of a pedestrian kind of, New York being an elevator that could fit 10 people in it, had 12 people in it. It became less about that and became more about the kind of the surreality of life, and they took many more chances. The show became much more physical over the last few years. I look at a lot of the way that Michael Richards' character grew even to kind of a cartoon version of what Dick Van Dyke used to do. That the tripping over the sofa. I mean, he was always going to do some sort of pratfall on a show that was kind of built in, but it just represented the arc of the show. I think it became much more surreal, and yes, Peterman represented that because Peterman was kind of like the I guess the Mr. Magoo of the turn of the century. He was kind of a corporate lunatic.
Well, he was sort of inhabiting the show and also inhabiting a completely separate reality, too. Mm-hmm. I mean, exactly. He's part of the lives of these four characters, but there's a sense that there's this whole other Peterman universe going on that we'll never see, that he'll be constantly speaking of in this highly stylized way.
Exactly. Yeah, it was. It was kind of. It was a Hemingway novel taken to an absurd degree.
So, we have so many questions to ask, and there are many people calling in with questions. We should probably grab a break here. Our number, 860-275-7266. We'll be back with John, Andy, and Roger after this.
My name is George.
Ball.
Master of the house, doling out the charm. Ready with the handshake and an open palm. Dances all she can, doling out the charm. Ready with the handshake and an open palm.
Ask Jerry, I'm Cosmo Kramer, the Yes Man. Ask Jerry, I'm Cosmo Kramer, the Yes Man. You bite it, you bought it. You bite it, you bought it.
Just. All right.
Just do it.
Then, in the distance, I heard the bulls. But I began running as fast as I could. Fortunately, I was wearing my Italian Capto Oxfords. Sophisticated, yet different, without making a huge fuss about it. Rich, dark brown calfskin leather, matching linen vamp. Men's whole and half sizes, 7 through 13, price $135.
Oh, that's not too expensive.
I like that shirt. Where did you get it?
Oh, this innocent-looking shirt has something which isn't innocent at all. Touchability. Heavy, silky Italian cotton, a fine, almost terry cloth-like feeling. 5-button placket, relaxed fit, innocence and mayhem at once.
That's not bad.
So everybody's laughing at that, and one of the things that Seinfeld is about, I think, is about language, very specifically about language. So we have Peterman, and we'll come back to him in a second, but here he's just talking very much in the language of his own catalog. But as he goes on, he becomes this almost, in the episodes that follow, this kind of almost Edwardian speaker, or even older than that. He's like a character out of Thackeray in the way that he kind of inverts language and speaks in very old-fashioned ways. But Roger Catlin, it seems to me, one of the things that this show does in a way that I think is without parallel, except for, as you say, Curb Your Enthusiasm, is examine what language means and what conventions mean. Andy was just talking about the episode where you get the job, of course. And there's something that follows that of course now means something, and there's a whole sort of bunch of semiotic information built up there. Well, of course, whatever follows, of course, has to kind of contravene whatever's good about getting the job. It's similar to that to what they did in Curb Your Enthusiasm, where they all explored the convention. Having said that, whatever follows that has to undercut whatever came before. But I don't know if there's a show like that is really sort of looked at language quite that way, the way that people talk.
And the deeper story is it's just how we all interact. I mean, it's just how we kind of flail around at trying to connect and using just the correct phrase. But there's a deeper thing too. I think when they had that episode where Jerry was suspected of being gay or something, and they added every time someone said that, they said, not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that was a very important episode, because I think it came at a time when people were starting on sitcoms too. I mean, that was, if someone was suspected to be gay, that was the punchline. Like, that was supposed to be funny enough for people. Suddenly, at this most popular sitcom that was around, they kept saying, not that there's anything wrong with that. And it was, in one hand, it's a commentary on, not that I would think that there would be anything wrong with that. There are liberals in New York. But also, it kind of just seeps into your mind, no, there isn't anything wrong with that. And I think that was a very important turning point for using that as a comic, end point.
Yeah, hi.
Someone's gay.
Andy, I'm not sure you could hear all that. Could you?
I'm sorry. No, for some reason I can't hear when Roger's speaking.
Okay, so
I found that to be true most of my life.
Yeah. So we've actually sort of added a special feature where you can't hear Roger speaking.
It happens throughout my life.
A technological modification we made. Well, he's talking about the not that there's anything wrong with that, and I'll ask both you and John a little bit about that, because I think that's an example of a phrase that has embedded itself in the language. It now has a kind of strength that exists. I mean, Roger was sort of saying, well, it really, in many respects, also reflected in a very serious way what changing attitudes were at that moment. But it's also it's
now an effect, I think, too.
Yeah,
it had an effect.
Yeah, it's stuck in the language right now, Andy. I mean, it must be interesting to have worked on a show where there are phrases like that will never be used the same way again.
Oh, sure, definitely. it's a kick to hear stuff you helped create repeated and kind of catch on, and it does sort of force you to think about things like not that there's anything wrong with that. To me, says it's like a step backwards. It's a very stigmatizing phrase. It's actually kind of saying, I think there's something seriously wrong with that. Why take the time and energy to say that unless there was something that sort of bothered you somehow?
Well, see, now I actually think we could have a Socratic conversation about that, because I'll tell you how I read it. I had an experience this summer that kind of hammered this home. So as for a magazine assignment, I was on a tour in Europe of tandem bike riders. Well, it turned out there were 79 tandem bikes that were being ridden by heterosexual couples. And then a male photographer and I were riding the other bike. And we're not a gay couple, and we, for some reason or other, felt it was important that these 79 other heterosexual couples know that we're not a gay couple. But we did keep tacking on, not that there's anything wrong with that,
right.
because it was simultaneously important for us to be identified as what we were, but also very important for us to sort of drive home the point that we wouldn't have felt stigmatized if we were something else.
Yeah. That's really funny. Yeah.
So, and so John O'Hurley, in some ways, this is another sort of distinction about Peterman, right? That everybody else is speaking the language of New York circa 1990. We're going to talk about yada yada in just a second here.
Mm-hmm.
But Peterman really, in some ways, he is that sharp contrast. He doesn't talk the way everybody else talks.
No, he was lyrical. And I think that was, and Andy, I may be putting words in your mouth, but I think from what I remember of speaking to the writers, they all enjoyed writing the Peterman character because they didn't have to write in single sentence or single word jokes, if you will. Not that there really were any setups and jokes, but they could write long form with Peterman, and that they could write these long, flowing monologues that were more often than not cut from the show because it was always too long. But they had the ability to write longer and create a different style of comedy with monologues.
True.
That sounds right on to me.
There is something about that, and there's something about the way in which Peterman kind of is that person. He's also recognizable. He's not so exotic that he's not recognizable. He is the person who maybe works in your office, or maybe once upon a time you worked in an office where there was somebody who spoke really differently from everyone else, but also kind of assumed that he was speaking the vernacular, the way that everybody else talks. So Peterman will say something like, "Who among us has not slipped into the break room to nibble on a love Newton," or whatever it is that he says. As if he says it in a way that sort of suggests, and John, a lot of this is your delivery, as if everybody would know exactly what he's talking about.
Exactly. I remember turning to Elaine once and saying, "Elaine, do you have any idea what happens to a butter-based frosting after 6 decades in a poorly ventilated British basement? I have a feeling what you're about to go through will be punishment enough."
All right, so it's good that you can still quote these things, too. That's impressive.
Oh,
okay.
They never leave you.
So I'm about to ask Roger something, and you won't be able to hear him, but we'll figure that out somehow, too. So actually, before I do that, let's play the yada yada clip. To me, this is the supreme example in some ways, or one of the supreme examples, if there can be more than one supreme, of Seinfeld's linguistic explorations.
Are you close with your parents?
Well, they gave birth to me and yada yada.
Yada what?
Yada yada yada. Engaged to be married. We bought the wedding invitations and yada yada yada. I'm still single.
So what's she doing now?
Yada.
So, and this all sort of arises from a situation where George, I think his girlfriend has been with a different man, an old boyfriend the night before, and yada yada. She feels tired today, and then they have a long conversation about whether you can yada sex, right? Can you yada sex? I think Elaine says something like, "Oh, I've yada sex," and they said, "Give us an example." And she says, "I went out to dinner with a lawyer. We had great lobster bisque. Yada yada yada. He never called me again." And so Roger, this is sort of the Seinfeld writers obviously picking up this thing. They've heard people, doing the yada yada thing, and it's what you would call grammatically an elision, right? It's the ... in a sentence, right. And the question, and there's a philosophical question being asked: what can you yada? What can you elide without describing? I mean, you do want to skip over something. Usually, it's the boring details, but if people are using it in a different way, that's the violation of some kind of linguistic compact.
Yeah, it was a word I was aware of, and it was a use that people. It was something people used that I was familiar with. But I think after Seinfeld did yada yada, you talk about Seinfeld launching things into the public. I thought they ended it. I thought they did everything they could with that. And anybody who ever used yada 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 after that, I thought was, you're too late. It's all over. Seinfeld ended that.
Andy and John, Roger just said he hated the show. He didn't think anything was funny about it. No, that's not what he said. I feel like I have a lot of power right now, though, that I can sort of ascribe various sentiments to Roger.
I've been misinterpreted before.
But actually, one of the things he did say is about the way in which Seinfeld did kind of sometimes almost preempt these phrases and seize them and use them. I know that I can no longer begin a sentence. And this is Curb Your Enthusiasm, but it's all part of the same continuum. I can't do having said that without feeling this huge pang of guilt and having to stop and back up and kind of requalify that because it's so tainted comically by what's been done to it. And I think yada yada might be in that same category. And so Andy, I guess I'll talk to you about that first. I mean, does it seem, maybe it's hard from within to think about that, but does it seem to you that Seinfeld did change the way language is used? And we lost Andy again. So I'm going to go over to John because I have a similar question for you, which is, I mean, so much of what is in Seinfeld is kind of iconic. It's fundamentally iconic, and Peterman is iconic. You've gone on to do all kinds of other things. You write music, you record music, you write books, you've gone on to perform. You can do Spam-A-Lot very easily and be King Arthur because in some ways that really is, using some...
It's the same character. King Arthur and J. Peterman are just the same people 1,000 years removed.
Yeah, or you're at least using some of the same comic chops. But is Peterman so iconic that it's going to be... I know you've done drama since that time, but is it hard? Do people just sort of see you and start laughing because they associate you with a certain kind of high comedy?
It's funny that has happened, and I have gotten that reaction before, where my name will, or my face will pop up on a screen, and people will start laughing in a movie theater. But yeah, it does kind of fun. But I don't mind that. I really don't. The fact that I made some people smile and laugh, and it's like it's kind of what you always hoped for. So the fact that it happens to fall on the comedic side, not the dramatic side, I'm fine with that.
All right, we're going to grab a call or two here, 860-275-7266. We have lots of calls. Here's Rick in Cheshire. Hi, Rick.
Hello. How are you?
Good.
I have actually two sort of observations and was curious to hear what the panel had to say. When I began watching Curb Your Enthusiasm, it seemed like Larry David was almost the darker, more neurotic soul of the show, and maybe Seinfeld was sort of the lighter, sweeter side. The second observation is that I've never thought the show is about nothing. It's more about how maybe comedy is written or thought of, in that, here's the premise, that there's something weird or something that rubs us the wrong way that we haven't fully articulated, like double dipping or close talking, and the show just explained or elaborated on that premise and how it becomes funny. So just curious to hear what you all think about that.
Well, go ahead.
Jump in.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
I'll jump in. I think that's exactly right. I never really subscribed to the idea it was about nothing. I think what was masterful about Seinfeld was the way that it embraced minutia, and not only singular minutia, but three types of minutia in every show, because it was an A, B, and the C storyline, and all of them would cross paths at one point in the show, and that was the brilliance of it. Well, not necessarily organically, but sometimes a little forced, but watching those three paths cross was just genius. But I think it was about embracing minutia, and how far can you get down into minutia?
Right, and one of the many questions that arose in my mind as we were getting ready for the show, the caller just mentioned double dipping. I started wondering whether the phrase double dipping, referring to the dipping of a chip that you've already bitten into dip, obviously the phrase double dipping has been around for a long time, but that usage, I was wondering, I'm unsure as to whether it's absolutely pinnable to Seinfeld, but it's a great example of minutia. Let's hear that clip really quickly.
Did you just double dip that chip? Excuse me? You double dipped the chip.
Double dipped? What are you talking about?
You dipped the chip, you took a bite, and you dipped again.
So?
That's like putting your whole mouth right in the dip. Look, from now on, when you take a chip, just take one dip and end it.
Well, I'm sorry, Timmy, but I don't dip that way.
Oh, you don't, huh?
No. You dip the way you want to dip. I'll dip the way I want to dip.
Give me the chip!
Hey!
The overlay to that, of course, is all happening at a wake. Andy Robin, I think we have you back. I think I hear you chuckling in the background. Yeah. So one of the things that it seems that Seinfeld also is mining, John just said minutiae, or somebody said minutiae, what do people really care about? People care about food. They care about their clothes, what they're wearing. People care about relationships and sex. In a way, this show, rather than being about... Did you ever buy the "this is a show about nothing" claim?
No, not at all. Nothing to some people. If you're super well-adjusted and you don't care about offending people too much, then maybe it's a show about nothing. But it's a show about... I think a lot of the comedy, like that scene, comes from fear of offending people, or more often than not, actually offending people. And I was just thinking that probably a lot of the writers, myself included, just happen to offend people, family members, or superiors or teachers early on in life with things that were just surprising to them, and it makes you hypersensitive to the rules of social etiquette, and am I going to screw up, and will this person care about something that that most people wouldn't care about?
I do think that it's exactly as you said, and I was even thinking, rewatching the Soup Nazi episode today. I just spent about 3 days in New York, and I was realizing that it really does catch a certain kind of anxiety that you have about walking into a certain kind of place. And I'm from Connecticut, which means I'm a little more wishy-washy. When you're in New York, you walk into Murray's Bagel. You got to know what kind of bagel you want. You got to say it in a nice, clear voice. They don't want to sit there and watch you dither through your choices. That obviously the Soup Nazi is this huge exaggeration of that, but it really is about a kind of anxiety. And I find myself walking in and kind of mentally rehearsing that I'm going to ask for an everything bagel with veggie cream cheese, kind of the way George does. Like, I don't want to screw it up. I want to do it right. I don't want to be the guy who's stalling the line. Right.
This fear that everybody else in the world knows the rules and you don't. Or that you're going to slip up in some unacceptable way.
Roger Catlin, we're going to go to break here in just a second, so it's a good time to ask you a question that Andy won't be able to hear your answer to. Just to go back to the caller and the first part of his question, I do think that Seinfeld did at least fiddle with, in a really interesting way, the concept of ensemble. Okay, so ensemble comedies have been around forever, and the notion was that you probably would have to. You're best off if you have this kind of moral locus near the center of the ensemble comedy. So Mary Tyler Moore Show marries the moral locus. Then there's all kinds of other people who represent various perverted attitudes or cynicisms or whatever or lyrical qualities. Peterman-esque lyrical qualities. Judd Hirsch does the same thing in Taxi. We could go on and on and on about this. And Seinfeld really, I don't know if they're the first show to break the mold. You could probably come up with a few others. But they really sort of said, no, we're really not going to do it that way. To a certain degree, I guess Jerry Seinfeld is the quote-unquote moral compass of the show. But by the standards of most shows, he would have to be one of the sort of moral and behavioral outliers, right?
Well, they all think they have their own moral code. That's why they get into the big fights, and they feel so strongly about everything. They can have these arguments about what seems like minutia, because they have decided, and they feel very strongly about these things. But at the same time, they're all amoral to the degree that the finale of Seinfeld has them all in jail and being, charged for all their various crimes through the years.
I won't even try to repeat what Roger just said, but as we go into break here, he makes a really interesting point, and I'll throw it out to both John and Andy Robin, which is it does seem in some ways maybe one of the other accomplishments of Seinfeld from a writing perspective, and Andy, I'll start with you on this and then go to John, is that all of the characters seem like they think they're the star of the series, right? I mean, of the four protagonists, each one is so deeply rooted in his or her own perspective that, you know, if you were to tell any one of these fictional characters you're in a comedy series, that person would absolutely assume that he or she was the focal point, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. I think that Kramer and Elaine are going to be more opinionated. Whether it's a strong moral compass or an appropriate moral compass or not, I think those two probably had stronger feelings about etiquette and how to behave. But yeah, and actually, if there is a moral center to the show, I would say it's Kramer. He seems to have the most stories where he was sympathizing with someone or chiding someone. Yeah, I don't know if if you guys feel similarly.
And John, really, you're playing a character who also thinks he's the star of the series, right? I mean, Peterman basically thinks everybody else is.
He's more than that. He's a legend in his own mind, of course.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that you can discuss about Seinfeld was the fact that every character on the show was kind of passionately dispassionate. I mean, you look at George. George swung from the middle rung on the ladder of life. All he wanted to be was mediocre. And he would defend his mediocrity with a passion unlike I've ever seen a character, which I think made the character the toughest character to play in the show. You know, Kramer had his physical comedy and the absurdities, and Peterman his, and everybody else had their... But George had to defend the middle of the road in every episode and do it with a tour de force passion that was... just an extraordinary performance.
But I think he also nails some real eternal truths. I mean, from the mouth of this absolute terminal schlemiel come these really profound statements about the human condition. The one that I repeat all the time is he says at some point something like the key to the success of any relationship is that each person has to secretly think he's getting a better deal, which is really true, I think. Yep. You know, I mean, I think that kind of, it really does sort of sum up from a very...
I remember in the Frogger episode, too, when George had his record score on the Frogger machine that was going to be dismantled when the pizza shop closed. And he finally turned to Jerry and he says, "Jerry, I'm never going to have kids. This is all I have."
Don't take this away from me. All right, we have to take a quick break. We'll come back with more of Roger and Andy and John.
George is getting upset. This is outrageous, outrageous. A festivus for the rest of us.
Celeste, cast, rest, cess, has Celeste, cast, rest, cess.
The funny thing is, I am wearing the panties my mother laid out for me this morning. Today's show was produced by Katie Piques, Betsy Kaplan, and me. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by Keith Hernandez. For show pages, articles, and recipes from the Faith Middleton Show staff for Cinnamon Babka, visit our website at WNPR.org. On tomorrow's show, can a computer produce an original piece of art? And now, back to Colin.
It's even a little bit more complicated tomorrow. I don't know if I dare even try to explain it. But the question is, as thinking machines become more sophisticated, they write novels, they produce works of fine art. Is there still something human that's out of their reach? Anyway, we'll be talking about that with a very interesting group. We've got a very interesting group right now. We're talking about Seinfeld, now 25 years old here in 2014. With us, Roger Catlin, a TV critic, Andy Robin, one of the writers and producers for Seinfeld, and John O'Hurley, the immortal J. Peterman on Seinfeld. So, Andy Robin, Seinfeld is unusual not only in the sense that so many of its linguistic turns and ideas wound up embedded in the culture, but at least one example of something that was never said on the screen has also persisted a little bit. Maybe not quite so pervasively, but there's this idea that Larry David had this rule: no hugging, no learning. That was sort of part of the code behind the scenes of Seinfeld. First of all, how true is that? How often did one hear it? How rigidly was that enforced?
I think it was all sort of unsaid and understood that, anybody who got hired wasn't too keen on writing stuff that was warm and fuzzy and all about camaraderie and forgiveness. That we were just that was stuff that didn't really make us laugh. I mean, TV's filled with shows that are less comedies and more warmities. They just kind of give you a warm, fuzzy feeling, and we wanted, harder laughs. So for us, it was not just avoiding, the hugs and talking about being there for other people, but also tapping into the darker side and doing things that are selfish, manipulative, underhanded, secretive, because that's funnier.
And John O'Hurley, you know enough about the television business to know how hard this is to sell. I was talking to somebody else about the show Get a Life, the Chris Elliott show Get a Life. He told me that the Fox executives were kind of almost on the set all the time saying, well, at the end, Chris Elliott learns a lesson. He learns an important lesson, right? And they would say, no, he's a 36-year-old paperboy who lives with his parents. What lesson is he ever going to learn? But, I mean, commercially, John, this is a difficult thing to sell to people.
Oh, I don't know that Seinfeld would ever get off the ground right now. Because this was a show really, and I'm just sensing that this was a show that the network just backed off on and said, deliver us a tape at the end of the week that we can just stick in the machine and let the country watch. There was very, very little network oversight on the show because they trusted so much the vision of Larry and Andy and his writers there, and Jerry as well, that they really there was an inherent trust in the show once it had ramped up to a certain level, and that just doesn't exist anymore on television. There's such tight scrutiny by the network and participation by the network each week.
Roger Catlin, you probably know that your colleague Matt Zoller Seitz has made the argument that without Seinfeld, we wouldn't have quite what we had in the form of Tony Soprano, Walter White, all these characters who exist in drama. I'm not sure I buy this argument, but I think what Matt is saying anyway is that this no hugging, no learning thing created a whole new set of expectations, not just in comedy, but even in drama. That characters could exist in a different way, could be flawed and funny, and Nate Fisher in 6 Feet Under could sort of never really be rehabilitated. I can't even say that as a word. He can't be rehabilitated. I don't. Do you buy that argument that Seinfeld changed other things besides comedy?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but and it's quite a leap from Seinfeld to a mob boss. But I can see where he might be thinking that you can learn to love a character that has flaws, that has drawbacks, that is a little selfish, that has some parts of his personality that need to be working on. And you can continue to follow him. And so the anti-hero in comedy might be something that certainly Seinfeld was one of the first to put out front.
And so, I mean, the distinction with a lot of those characters, obviously people like Tony Soprano and Nate Fisher exist on HBO. Walter White existed on AMC. So I'll go back to you for Andy Robin. You'll have the last word. We've got about 45 seconds left. Is what's amazing about Seinfeld that you were able to do this on network TV before cable, before HBO and Showtime existed as a place to go experiment?
Yeah, I think I was totally spoiled. I think it ruined me for other projects, and it was one of a kind. And part of it was lack of network oversight early on, lack of micromanagement, and also there were fights early on. Jerry and Larry stuck together, and they said, we won't do the show unless we can do it our way. And they called the network's bluff, and they managed to stay on the air. So I feel like they really threaded a needle. And I feel really lucky that I got to work on it.
All right. We feel very lucky that we've gotten to talk to John O'Hurley, to Andy Robin, and to Roger Catlin today. Thanks very much also to Katie Piques, part of our Fab Five team of interns. We're losing them one by one. It's breaking my heart. They've been incredible, but Katie Piques was instrumental in pulling this whole show together. And thanks to everybody else who helped out. We'll be back tomorrow with Compumanities, the humanities of computers.
I'm Kyone Wolf. What's the deal with the Colin McEnroe show? You could turn it off at any time. I prefer the theater, where the audience is trapped.